Okay, chapter 4 is the last letter in this short epistle of the Apostle Paul to the church in Colossae. And he picks up on where he left off in the last chapter. Remember, the Colossians didn't get this letter in chapter and verse. We added that later on. But he says here in verse 1, "Masters, be just and fair to your slaves. Remember that you also have a master in heaven." Now, this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of the next letter in our reading plan, the letter to Philemon, because Philemon was a Christian in Colossae, and he actually had a slave that had run away. That slave's name was Onesimus, and he ran away, and then Paul presumably met Onesimus, and Onesimus became a Christian in Rome. And so Paul met him. And part of the reason that Paul writes Colossians and even Philemon was to give instruction about a very specific situation. And it's namely this, that Philemon, the slave owner, would take back Onesimus, right? Would forgive him and take him back. And so this is just a little bit of a foreshadowing. You'll get into that a little bit more in the next book that we're going to read in our reading plan, Philemon, right? Okay, so as we scroll down a little bit further, Paul gives us instruction. He says, "Live wisely among those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone." And so he's giving the church in Colossae, and I think this is good for our churches today as well, just insight into the way you should think about outsiders as a Christian. Don't be a Christian jerk. Don't shove the biblical worldview down people's throats, but just live wisely among unbelievers and give them an opportunity to hear the gospel by being gracious and filled with the Spirit, right? And so what a great message for all of us today as we try to help other people pursue God. And then he gives some final instructions and greetings here at the end of the letter. He talks about Tychicus, right? So Tychicus was the messenger who carried this letter to the Colossians, and he also was the one who carried the letter of Philemon to about Onesimus to Philemon, right? So he says, "I'm also sending Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, one of your own people." Once again, Onesimus was a slave, but he's trying to help the Christians to understand that in the Christian church, there's no such thing as a slave and a free person, or a master and the slave himself. That as Christians, we should all accept one another, which is a totally radical thought. I mean, it's a whole new way of thinking. And Paul is trying to help them to understand that. He says, Onesimus and Tychicus will tell you everything that's happening here, right? And so then he continues on and he sort of finishes off his letter. I'll let you read it for yourself. But he says this in verse 16, "After you have read this letter, pass it on to the church at Laodicea so that they can read it too. And you should read the letter that I wrote to them." And by the way, in case you're wondering, we don't have that letter anymore. We don't know what that letter said to the church in Laodicea, but I think we can make a pretty good guess that it would be a lot like this letter, a lot like Ephesians, the letter to the Ephesians. So many of Paul's letters had those same themes running through it. It was all about Jesus, it's all about the gospel, and it's all about how to live in a way that really reflects that we truly are followers of Jesus. So anyway, you're ready to read Colossians chapter 4. We'll see you tomorrow for Philemon.